Good afternoon, class. This video is part 2 of the lecture on Sartre's work, Existentialism as a Humanism. The edition I am using is this one right here, Existentialism as a Humanism by Jean-Paul Sartre, and it is by Yale University Press. And so when I provide quotes, and the page numbers are from that text. So in the last video, we looked at two key phrases in Sartre's existential philosophy. Those two phrases are existence precedes essence, and that we are condemned to be free. So in this video, I want to briefly review those two concepts and give references to those concepts. And then I want to go over the next concept, which Sartre refers to as abandonment. And he does so as a consequence of those two former phrases, that existence precedes essence and that we're condemned to be free. And he does so with a very detailed example of a student of his asking for advice on what to do during World War II. And so we'll go over that example. And then for next time, we will look at why Sartre doesn't think we can look to signs for advice on what to do. So let's go ahead and begin. So this is Sartre's discussion, a discussion on Sartre's work, Existentialism as a Humanism. And the two, like I mentioned before, the two phrases we're going to review before we begin is that existence precedes essence, and he gives the example of the paper cutter, or he uses the word paper knife. It's a paper cutter on page 22, and that we are condemned to be free, which comes a bit later. So Sartre's type of existentialism is an atheistic existentialism. He does not believe in any type of creator God. And because he doesn't, this is one of the facts that help his idea of existence preceding essence. If there was a creator God that created human beings for a purpose and therefore gave human beings a nature, this nature or essence would come before existence. And therefore the phrase would be reversed. And so he says as much with the quote on page 22. He says, what do we mean here by existence precedes essence? We mean that man first exists. He materializes in the world, encounters himself, and only after defines himself. Thus, there's no human nature, since there's no God to conceive of it. Man is nothing otherwise than what he makes of himself. This is the first principle of existentialism. So here, because there's a lack of nature, there's only first existence, and we can draw, if we have any type of essence that we ourselves are creating retrospectively by looking at our actions. We're not determined by any type of nature. For Sartre, the opposite would occur if there were a creator God that created human beings, which would mean what we just mentioned. Essence would precede or come before existence. To further clarify his point, he gives the example of a paper knife or paper cutter, and he's sort of thinking about this hypothetically in his paradigm. He says, when God creates, he knows exactly what he is creating. Thus, the concept of man in the mind of God is comparable to the concept of a paper knife in the mind of the manufacturer. God produces man following certain techniques and a conception, just as the craftsman, following a definition and a technique, produces a paper knife. In this contrasting situation, the human being would have a nature, i.e., their essence would precede their existence, and therefore there would be somewhat limitations, or we might say a program, for what the human being can do and what the human being is supposed to do. And the latter supposed to do is probably most applicable to the counterexample. A direct result of this is that if our existence precedes our essence and we in fact have no nature, Sartre concludes that we are not determined by anything and are free. But this means we must take full responsibility for our actions, that we cannot rely on anyone or anything for guidance concerning how to act. And because we are in this situation, we are condemned to be free. When we think of guidance, a helpful comparison might be if something is manufactured and something about it goes wrong, or you are trying to do a job and you're not sure if this product can do it, you can look to some type of instruction manual and it can give you more specifications on what should or can be done. Sartre is saying that no such thing, no such instruction manual exists for the human being. Sartre explains that if, however, God does not exist, we will encounter no values or order that can legitimize our conduct. Thus, we have neither behind us nor before us in the luminous realm of values any means or of justification or excuse. We are left alone without excuse. That is what I mean when I say that man is condemned to be free. Condemned because he did not create himself, yet nonetheless free, because once cast into the world, he is responsible for everything he does. So whenever we decide to do one thing or another, according to Sartre, ultimately, the reason why we did it is because we freely chose to do it. And this is what he wants to stress with an example and explanation of abandonment. He describes the human condition up to now as having the following characteristics. So first, it has no pre-established human nature, and therefore no excuses for what we do, no guidance for moral decision-making, complete freedom and full responsibility. And the example he is going to provide of abandonment, which we'll go over momentarily, particularly stresses this no guidance for moral decision making. That's what he's trying to make clear to his audience with this lengthy example. And the example of moral decision making is an example Sartre gives of one of his students is attempting to decide either to stay home and take care of his mother or to join the French Free Forces and fight for his country during World War II. Sartre's French, the context of this moral decision takes place in France during the Second World War. The types of abandonment, the dimensions of abandonment, and what usually, according to Sartre, makes us think that we're not in that situation is that we have moral guidance from a variety of things. Institutions such as religion. Sartre will give the example of Christianity in this particular context. Moral imperatives. So you can have a religious guidance, but you can also have an ethical guidance and a moral imperative. What do you know what to do, for example, in any particular situation? The example he gives us of the Kantian philosophy, he says neither of those are any help here. Moral authority is often turned to, and he gives the example of asking different priests for advice. Priests in this example, again, are seen as having moral authority. And after this, he talks about people deriving some type of advice or knowing what to do from science. And he gives the example of a Jesuit he met. We'll talk about this latter example of science in the next lecture. But Sartre doesn't think that one realistically or ultimately can turn to any one of these things for guidance. All right, so this is Sartre talking. This is his example. To give you an example that will help you better understand what we mean by abandonment, I will mention the case of one of my students who sought me out under the following circumstances. His father had broken off with his mother and moreover was inclined to be a collaborator. Those who were sort of collaborating with the opposing forces during the war. His older brother had been killed in the German offensive of 1940, And this young man with primitive but noble feelings wanted to avenge him. His mother, living alone with him and deeply hurt by the partial betrayal of his father and the death of her oldest son, found her only comfort in him. At the time, the young man had the choice to go to England to join the Free French forces, which would mean abandoning his mother or remaining by her side to help her go on with her life. He realized that his mother lived only for him and that his absence, perhaps his death, would plunge her into utter despair. He also realized that ultimately any action he might take on her behalf would provide the concrete benefit of helping her to live, while any action he might take to leave and fight would be of certain uncertain outcome and could disappear pointlessly like water in sand. For instance, in trying to reach England, he might pass through Spain and be detained there indefinitely in a camp. Or after arriving in England or Algiers, he might be assigned to an office to do paperwork. He was therefore confronted by two totally different modes of action, one concrete and immediate, but directed towards only one individual, and the other involving an infinitely vaster group, a national corpse, yet more ambiguous for that very reason, and which could be interrupted before being carried out. And at the same time, he was vacillating between two kinds of morality, a morality motivated by sympathy and individual devotion, and another morality with a more broader scope, but less likely to be fruitful. He had to choose between the two. And so this is the particular situation in which Sartre aims to show to the audience, demonstrates abandonment. Sartre picks up the religious institutions in which the student is most familiar with. At this time, it is the example of Christianity, and he says Christianity's guidance for this moral dilemma is general. It says to love one's neighbor, to make sacrifices, to sort of walk the straight and narrow. But at the same time, it doesn't provide, according to Sartre, the particular guidance in which one to choose. Should he make sacrifices for his mother, or should he make sacrifices for his country? He says in this particular example, the general religion is not helpful. And so if one says, I did this or that because of the religion, what Sartre is going to say is, no, one made that decision because the religion isn't of the particular guidance. It doesn't have this particular example. Second, the moral imperative, and he uses the Kantian philosophy, i.e. one should never treat another person as a means. And that's all very well and good, but Sartre will say, well, if he stays with his mother, he's not treating his mother as a means but an end, but he's treating the people fighting as means to an end to allow him to do that. And if he goes and he fights with the soldier, he is not treating the mother as an end in herself, but as a not necessarily a means to an end, but he's not having her best interest in mind when he makes the decision. And so the Kantian philosophy, according to Sartre, is also not going to be a particular use. After looking at what both of these, the religious morality and the ethical moral imperative have to offer, according to Sartre, one is still left with having to make the decision. One can't simply say, I'm doing this because of the categorical imperative, I'm doing this because of my religious convictions. Sartre will say, oh, you're doing this ultimately because you decided to do it. Moral authority. So one can go and one can ask a person who's versed in morality and knowledge of what the moral decision making is. And in this particular example, it's the priest, because they're the religious authority that the student is familiar with. But there's different priests, according to Sartre, and the different priests are sympathetic to different sides in this battle. One might be more sympathetic to fighting in the French resistance. One might be more sympathetic to the collaborators. One might be more sympathetic to the taking care of the mother situation. And moreover, if you are knowledgeable about who you're asking for advice, according to Sartre, this is kind of interesting. You know exactly, or for the most part, what they're going to say. So if you go to see someone for advice who's sort of pro the French, the Free French fighters, then they're going to tell you to join the war. If you go see someone else who's more pro the collaborators, then they're going to tell you how to take care of the mother and don't fight. And so, according to Sartre, by choosing the person that you ask advice, you essentially choose the advice. So what about signs, right? Couldn't someone see certain signs in their lives as indications of what kind of choice they should make? Well, in the next video, we'll pick this up and we'll look at what Sartre says about why you cannot look at signs, nor can you look at the strength of feelings. So I hope this was helpful. This has taken us to page 31, and we will continue for next time after this with the example of why Sartre doesn't think you can look for signs, and he'll use the example of a person who decided to become a Jesuit. So thank you very much. I hope you found this helpful.